This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, doctoral students, and everyone in between, cultural workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Sharon Holland, who teaches in the Department of American Studies at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Along with numerous articles and editing work, she is the author of Raising the Dead, Readings of Death and Black Subjectivity from 2000, The Erotic Life of Racism from 2012, and An Other, a Black feminist consideration of animal life from 2023. She is also the co-host of the podcast Dog Save the People. In this discussion, we explore questions of gender, animal life, and politics, and how they open up new horizons in the field of Black studies. Good morning, Sharon. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, John. Doing well. It's so good to be here with you today.
Welcome to Black Studies Podcast. Before I say that we get into it, I have to say we were talking right before this. So glad you have a professional microphone. We will have radio quality audio, which is always nice on these conversations.
Yes, it is.
And I'll make a link to your podcast as well in the narrative that goes with this. But I'm really excited that you made time to be on the podcast. I've really loved your work and followed it for a long time. And I just think it makes such innovative interventions in the field and really challenges so many of us to think differently and think more broadly. And you've just introduced really important critical shifts in Black studies and related fields. And so having you on this podcast is a real treat. It's going to be just an amazing contribution to the series. So thank you for making the time. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for the kudos. Thank you so much.
So we'll get into, obviously, talking about, how you think about the field of Black studies and your work in relation to it. But I wanted to start with what I guess is a more personal question, which is, what drew you to the study of Black life? What interested you and drew you to Black studies? And for me, also always an interesting part of that, which is what sustains you in that kind of work?
Such a great question. I guess one of the answers that I have is that I'm a Black woman in America. I had to find out what that meant, what that would mean for me in both my career and in my personal life. Of course, I had already found out what that meant through my mother's experience, through, the other women in my family. But what drew me to Black study was a core group of seniors in college, a mentor in high school, who were Black. The folks I met in college at Princeton were Black studies majors. And they really pulled me into the discourse because we would, have study groups and they would be talking or arguing about a book. And I'm like, what book are y'all reading? And, I was that generation who, went to Sunday school, and Sunday school in many ways was like Black study. Whatever they weren't teaching us in the schools about who we were as a people, what we had contributed as cultural producers, that was all covered in Sunday school. And I loved it. I loved knowing about, plasma, its discovery by a Black man, and the peanut, and, Harriet Tubman, who was always already one of my heroines from a very early age, right? Interestingly enough, my family of origin wasn't all that quote unquote political, right? But I went to school during a time of the culture wars in the 80s, and it just didn't seem to be an option. So the more I learned about, Black study from the beginning, the more I wanted to be a part of it, the more I wanted to also help shape it, because I could see gaps. I could see, where am I going to find the voices of women? Where am I going to find the voices of the marginalized in society, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, no, this is when you were talking about Sunday school, it made me think of one of our previous podcasts with Jay Carter, and this is one of the things that he was talking about was this notion of the church as a site of Black study and what that means. But
Hmm.
also when you said, learning about, plasma and the peanut, that's going to make a great sort of essay title
I know,
on this
right?
very topic. And it's catchy, but it's substantial, in the sense of there've also been these other podcasts, not to be too intro podcast or referencing, but I was thinking like when this one that my collaborator Ashley did with Nathaniel Norman, and Norman was talking about, his introduction to Black study were these little cards that used to come with 6 packs of Budweiser, and they would have like African kings and African queens, and it's really interesting to think about these. I don't want to say random occurrences because they're designed and they're
Hmm.
part of life worlds, but these things that don't typically get associated in a sort of academic context with study end up being formative. And for you, that's so interesting. Also, that formative, not just sparking this sort of curiosity, interest, commitment, but also that thing you said about I wanted to change the field, I wanted to alter it.
Yes, and for full disclosure, when I was 12 years old, I left the church, and I actually write about it in a group of essays that I'm working on about my journey through food, and as a home cook, and as someone deeply passionate about um, food systems and how we eat what we eat. And I remember going to my mother at 12 and giving her, just basically my position paper. Here's the reason why I don't want to go to church anymore.
Hmm.
And a lot of it had to do with, I didn't feel like I had the shared feeling of folks there, you know. But I don't think it was until the last decade that I really realized how formative the Black church can be and how important it is in the lives of Black folks. So while not going to church with my mother gave me freedom to concentrate on other things, and also, I'm a feeling person. My intellect is very much driven by my intuition, and I think it was good and right and true that I told my mom, I'm not feeling the same things, and I don't want to be in a collective holding the collective down when I feel things in other directions.
Mhm.
And, it was the first time I think, in my eyes, I remember growing up because my mom looked at me and she said, okay, Sharon Pre Holland, we'll let you do that. I'll let you do that. And I made a little trade. I said, I'll cook all the food for the after service once a month, and you can take it. Right. And then just tell people you sent me to a private school where there's too much studying to do and I can't go to church on Sundays. Right. And it wasn't like we were in a particularly marginal, marginal course of Black church study. Right. We weren't a small storefront or a small community church. This was the AME Zion church, so it was pretty
Mhm.
huge and fairly bourgeois in Washington, D.C. in particular. So I remember that as a profound moment. It produced in me a disconnection from Black life in a particular way,
Mhm.
one that has survived for many other folks who have been involved in Black life. And so my trajectory has been a little bit different. But I see how much, I think, Jay Cameron's absolutely right. The church was foundational for me. But also leaving the church was foundational for me. And so I think that formed my critical mind in many ways because I had to form my own version of what Black
Yeah.
study, what Blackness meant for me.
I mean, negation is formative as well as affirmations.
Exactly,
Yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly.
And as someone who really, I mean, I write a lot, like most of us do, but really primarily identify or love my life as an educator. I love that the seniors mentored you as you came to college. This is something I'm always trying to get students to do. It's hard because, I teach now on a large campus. Previously on a small campus was a little easier, but that's such a clutch moment that you shape somebody as they come in. I mean, I had the same kind of a different narrative, of course, but that same kind of moment of arriving in college and juniors and seniors in the areas that I was interested in really, they were already talking in ways that I wanted to talk. I just
Exactly.
love that.
Exactly. And I became literate in Black study, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as I moved through college, Frances Rogers Rose, who just passed in November, the sociologist, was one of my teachers. Gloria Naylor came and taught a course on Black women's literature, and there were about 12 of us in that class. We had to fill out essays to apply. It was one of the most formative classes because it was through Gloria Naylor that I met the great late Toni Morrison. And when she came to campus to do one of the first readings from Beloved, and I never forget, you could hear a pin drop in the auditorium where she read those first words, 124 was spiteful. Those experiences, because of Frances Rogers Rose, because of Lila Karp, who was director of the Women's Center, because of Rochelle Shelley Hendricks, who was one of the assistant deans and was amazing, because of Emory Elliott. These individuals mentored me and put books in my hands and said, Lila Karp said, I think you need to go read Audre Lorde Zami. And I'm like, why, Lila? I think she knew I was queer before I knew I was queer. And I think she knew that whatever I was getting wasn't enough. I was still searching for reflection. And I never forget, reading Zami in my junior year just changed everything. I was like, oh, there's a place for the kind of love I have for women. That has always been the bedrock of my work. I have a brief for Black women, although sometimes I jokingly say in my books, I don't carry a brief here, right? And I think it's important, and for whatever the category of woman might mean to us, right? Because on the one hand, theoretically, obviously, there are contestations. On the other hand, there's the life that we walk in these bodies that signify to people certain things.
Yeah, no, this is, I always say this, but it's my favorite part of these podcasts is hearing how people came to this work. And I have to say, I love mentorship. I loved having mentors and people, accidental or intentional mentors, and doing that kind of work. So I'm really, really I feel really, even though I don't know them, I'm so happy to hear those names and have them on the podcast because those people, their names should be out there for all of us. And, Toni Morrison reading from this new novel, Beloved, that's just a moment in time.
Oh, wow. I never
That's
forget.
kind of unmatched. That's like wild.
I actually got to, we had a running joke. Professor Morrison would see me, throughout my career. Whenever she came to town, I would ask to be invited to lunch, having been, at Princeton when she came. And I was the one assigned to get her coffee. And I ran into the student center and I cut to the front of the line and said, I'm picking up coffee for Toni Morrison. Get out of my way. But I put it in the podium in a place she couldn't reach it. She didn't know it was there. And so afterwards, when she was doing the signings of the book and just talking to folks, she's like, what happened to my coffee? And I was devastated. I'm like, but I put it a little further back, right underneath so it wouldn't spill. Oh, I can't believe you didn't see it. So after that, she would go, well, here comes the coffee girl. And we would laugh. And she was always generous and kind. And she said something to me once, we were at lunch and the lunch was over and we were just milling about outside. She was getting ready to go to her next meeting on campus, and she just turned around to me and she said, keep up the good work. And by that time, my first book was out, and I had a chapter on Beloved thinking through Hortense Spiller's concept of the flesh. As folks say, I'm an OG. I took on the flesh, 20 years ago, right? Because I thought there was some resonance with Spiller's and with Morrison in terms of the clearing and in terms of what flesh was supposed to mean. And I know she must have been, at least I felt she must have been talking about that essay, that chapter. And, I went home that night with the lightest step. And
I can only imagine.
I know, because when you write about a writer's work, the highest compliment they can pay you is to either argue with you about it, right? Or to wink at you and go, not bad. So, so I had, like I said, the mentors in my life, Emory Elliott mentored so many people, and many of us would not have made it through Princeton as like African descended students if Emory hadn't gone to bat for us on several occasions.
Yeah, I love that. No, this is phenomenal. You have that was quite a moment for you to sort of wander through Princeton. So I love it.
I know. In the days when it was kind of, more grungy preppy than it nowadays, people asking, what was it like to be here? I'm like, the here you experience is not the Princeton that we experienced in the 80s. It was not pristine in that way.
As an 80s college person myself, we're probably around the same age. There's even the fancy places were not, what do they call them? Like country clubs.
Exactly.
They've all become these days.
Yeah, they really have. Everything looks so like they were serving linguine and clams for lunch in one of the dorms, when I went back to visit a couple of years ago, and I was like, wow.
My own child has his first apartment and it's brand new. And I just thought, I can't imagine my first apartment not being something where you worry about like skin infections from the carpet. I don't know.
Or the heat being off in those old buildings and calling maintenance and saying, well, put the fireplace on.
Or on during the summer. Yes.
I know.
Erratic.
I know.
I guess, I don't know. I could come up with some justification, but I won't. I'll just stay a cranky old man on that. So.
Exactly.
Well, let me ask you about the field of Black studies sort of broadly. And I want to ask how you imagine the field. Sort of what is the portrait of the field for you that you work with? And I ask this always in the context of its origin story, which was that demand by students for study of the Black intellectual tradition, which traditional disciplines hadn't treated in any kind of detail, if at all. And so that demand, of course, is one of those motivating forces behind the founding of Black studies. But that, of course, was also in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when Black liberation struggle had taken that post-civil rights turn toward a more sort of radical intervention and a collapse between things like study and politics, between campus and community and classroom and activism. So there's that deeply political, prescriptive dimension of the field of Black studies at its origin, and also that commitment to its intellectual life. And I think that tension, I never want to call it a contradiction, but that tension, I think that's still with us in the field, that we still wrestle with that in trying to talk about what exactly Black studies is. And so I'm interested in hearing you talk broadly about specifically about your own vision of Black studies, but also how you think about it in relation to this origin story.
Yeah, I think that's so important, right? And I couched this recently in relationship to DEI, right? And we were having a discussion about it as scholars. I am on fellowship at the Institute for the Arts and Humanities. And as someone who's been in the profession for quite some time, I said to them, most people look at DEI. Most people look at what DEI has engendered on campuses, right? What it has helped to create as kind of the answer, right? The kind of structure that was put in place in response to, right, the radical requests, the requests coming from Black study, Latinx study, Indigenous study, those early moments, women and gender studies, right? And I was, saying, I don't really think, I said, DEI is not a response to that at all. I said, the true vision of Black study on college campuses in particular, in my opinion, hasn't been the radical vision of the activists and students who wanted to start these programs, right? Has not been achieved, right? A perfect example would be when I was in college. The Thirlwell Center doesn't exist anymore, but that's what we called it. And we had this kind of policy which followed the Black radical tradition. So I'm getting at something here, right? That the basement at the center, which is, not the nicest place, but not awful. We had mattresses there, and we told people, like, anyone coming into town needs a place to stay. Anyone needs to get out of the cold, they can sleep here. And so that radical vision of community, of what we now call mutual aid, of our intellectual work being tethered to a community of folks who we wanted to support with our presence in these places. That vision slowly began to fade over the course of the 80s and 90s in the culture wars, right? The demand that center directors have PhDs. So a lot of folks who had those ties to communities, were stripped of those jobs, who were many of whom were activists, right? And so I feel that in Black study, some of that tension remains, and that some of us are interested in, Black radical thought, right? And I think of this as not necessarily fugitive thought, right? But insurgent thought, right? What does it mean? And that, to me, that is thought that's at the outside. So what I try to do in my work, and what I'm most interested in, and what I think Black study has achieved on college campuses, is at least opening up some kind of method, through which we can get closer to that Black radical tradition, even though all of us in Black study might not necessarily be interested in the Black radical tradition. I think that tradition's really important to me. It helps me to ask the outside question. And I think that the fundamental core of Black study is a critique of itself. These things are really great that we did, but these other sexist, homophobic things, not so much, right? How does Black study exist within an institution with all of its isms and not, in a sense, conform in some way, shape, or form, right? To that institution's culture? How do we keep Black study, how do we keep it secure in radical thought? And I'm not thinking about radical thought that's maybe might just be tied to a Marxist position. I'm thinking of radical thought that's the outside of the outside. When someone's asking a question, ask who's not at the table, who's not included in these questions. And I think Black study is getting there right now with the challenges to the category of the human that are coming forward and have been coming forward. One could say from Sylvia Wynter's work, but I mean even more concerted challenge to the human, in terms of okay, so we understand what types of human might be possible, what types of humanity are possible, but can we think outside the question of humanity itself in Black study?
I love that. That's so much to think about. This having that, what you just said on the podcast, this is hugely important, and for a lot of reasons. And so it's going to give everybody a lot to think about. So just generally, just thank you for that. And I love this notion of the insurgent. I mean, part of it is it's a term I really like. So I'm like, oh, yes, insurgent. I like that as a model, which is different than fugitive. But I love that idea of insurgent not just as a characterization of certain kinds of thinking, but as an orientation in the field. Like, how can I be an insurgent? What does it mean to challenge myself, to position myself as a member of this field in the insurgent mode, right? And what does that ask of me in terms of my literacy and my teaching and my scholarship, perhaps? But also, as you say, in my own relationship to an institution where my conformity gets me rewards, right? How do I position myself as an insurgent as a way of honoring, in some ways, just honoring that origin of the field? Like, as you said, we can't just say the field has always been like this. I love the example of the center director needing a PhD, needing to be a professor, and how that fundamentally changes things. Yeah, I had never thought of that, but that's actually a profound shift. That's not just a credential shift. It's a culture and politics shift.
Yeah. And I was in college when that started to happen. The directors of the Women's Center and the Third World Center were both, one was actively pursuing a PhD, the other had a PhD equivalent. But, the university wanted to cut off those community ties. And the best way to do that is to take from the 10%, right?
Yeah.
Who don't have access to those, the kind of time and resources it takes to pursue PhDs. I think in insurgents is where, I think in my last book project, another, a Black feminist consideration of animal life, I wanted to rethink our relationship with non-human animals as a field of inquiry. And I wanted to actually follow in the footsteps of those who already were doing that, who were Black and brown people. And I think Move is my most classic example. When I began to study them, when I found out it was through Michael Hames Garcia's work, there was a little moment in this text where he talked about how the Move organization protested at zoos and circuses and puppy mills in their early incarnation. And I was like, what? I had never heard that before. And why haven't we talked about that? And what difference does that radical the radical nature of their work, right? That they were, and I hate it when people say they were moving beyond race, right? I don't think they were moving beyond race. They were thoroughly caught up in it, right? As we all are, right? What they did was they were challenging a fundamental distinction between the human and the animal, which makes race and everything else, right? And I was blown away by the work that they were doing. I was blown away by the insurgency of it. And one of the biggest compliments I've received in the book was when a mentor who does 18th century work, read that and fired off an email to me saying, I was in Philly at the time. And I didn't understand completely why there was so much hatred of Move in that city and what had happened to them. And I always knew something else had to be going on. And when I read your chapter, it all fell in line and made sense to me. That there's a certain kind of violence that came to the members of Move, still continues to come to the members of Move, because of the radicality of their vision. And also the radicality of their living, right? Something that, that Kevin Quashie, speaks of often, right? What is Black aliveness? What is the course of Black living? I think that is also, for me, the question is, what is the course of Black living without the human as its center? Can there be Black living without the human? I'm really trying to, I think the tools are there in Black study to ask that question. I don't know if the tools are there in other forms of study to ask that question.
I love that. I mean, in some ways, you've answered this, already responded to this question. So I'll sort of shape it. But I'm, because I'm interested in how you think of your work in relation to the Black studies tradition, both sort of where it fits and what boundaries it pushes, and, thinking of it in terms of the short history, but nevertheless substantial history of the field. I was thinking about it because when I write these, send these questions, I also start thinking myself, having read your work. I'm like, where does it fit? Where does it push boundaries? But where do you think it fits and pushes boundaries?
Primarily, and I think I got this from my grandmother, right? I think that Black study is an ethical tradition. It's a tradition steeped in ethics. And I think my work tries to adhere as closely as possible to that ethical tradition. And I think of Harriet Tubman. There's a thing called slavery. It's an abomination. I'm not going to just sit here and let it continue. I'm going to go and steal souls away for as long as I can and as often as I can, because it's the right thing to do. And then she didn't look back. Right? I think of so many folks following, ethics, are vitally important. And I think we have a tradition and that's why in my last book I said, I think the question coming out of enslavement isn't necessarily an ontological one. The question coming out of enslavement is a more ethical one, right? What were our practices during enslavement? What were we tied closely to? And many of those ethical questions come out of Black women's fiction. Toni Morrison asked them all the time. Was it right what Sethe did? That's an ethical question, because ethical questions need to be decided before you get in the middle of things. Because if once you're in it, you can't. There's too much group speak, right? You have to say, this is what I'm going to do if I'm confronted with. I'm going to do X if I'm confronted with Y. I believe that this profound, only a people mired in an unethical life, unethical living for centuries, can come out, right, with some brilliant ways to still ask ethical questions, difficult questions, right? So I have a huge respect for the tradition of Black study. I know that Ida B. Wells was very much difficult in that way. If she thought you weren't coherent, you weren't towing the line of like being an ethical person in your space, she was like, oh, not working with you anymore. And she left many people be. She was like, nope, I'm not going to do that. And so how she aligned herself, her moving about, I take real solace in thinking about how she made her decisions and why. And that she made those decisions in Black community. She was unafraid to say, I don't really like this. And these are the reasons why. To try to make ethical connections. I think that this is the reason why Black study opened itself to animal study. Opens itself to animal study. It's been there all along, because that's, part of the ethical questions are about the human have to do with us as a species. So
I love this question of, how does Black studies look if we reframe it as an ethical question rather than ontological or epistemological or historical. I mean, I think historical study is so often, explicitly political, but also ethical, the kinds of things that we think are of value in the way we value them and put them in relationship. But starting with this ethical orientation, I think that's a profound question for the field, I was struck by something you said earlier about, that Black studies is part of what Black studies is always asking itself self-critical questions, right? What is Black studies? What ought Black studies be? And this question, what is the place of the ethical? What if we reframe it as ethical? I love that. That's something for all of us to be thinking about. I mean, I have to say, I'm particularly attuned to this. I actually agree with you, and I think that that conversation about the place of the ethical is field shifting. I don't want to say changing, but maybe I might turn some things upside down. But also, as you said, the things that have been there all along, that as soon as you reframe it as ethical, that's what critical theory does, right? It allows you then to see something that was there all along. That, work on move is a great example.
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm just saying, and it's so hard, like I said, in institutions, right, which are so fundamentally unethical, right? When you think about when you think about how they have been created, right? When you think about, one could say, even though this is Bentham's theories, right, are at the center of the establishment of different fields of inquiry, right? And the creation of the modern university. I'm not necessarily sure if Bentham's work is, if utilitarianism is an ethical inquiry or an ethical phenomena, right? We can only satisfy some of the people, not all of the people. We can only satisfy some of the people some of the time, and those that get left behind, well, and I feel like the ethical question is, why is that our calculus?
Yeah.
Why is that our calculus? And that doesn't have to be a world in which is shaped by leaving people behind, by not pleasing some over others. And of course, I'm giving a very draconian, there's thousands of pages on utilitarianism.
Sure.
Very truncated and draconian sense of what it is, but it is a philosophy that has created the modern university. And that is a philosophy in which Black study cannot stand.
Mm-hmm. Calculation has never been good for the history of Black people, to put it lightly.
Exactly.
I don't know how else to put it.
Yeah, that's just, no, that, and we as Black study practitioners know this.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, talking about all these ways that you've intervened in the field and developed your own work, I'm sort of curious how you think about that in relation to both your doctoral education and your professorships, your how and where you teach and research and the kinds of things that flow from that, because you did your PhD work in English and African American Studies, which is partially a disciplinary education, but what you've done after has been so embedded in the field of Black studies and the field of gender studies, and so really moving away from disciplines. And I'm interested in how that shift you think has shaped your research, but also how if it's shaped your classroom, because disciplinary classrooms are different than non-disciplinary classrooms.
Yeah, I made a conscious effort to leave English departments when I took the job in 2014 at UNC. I wanted to be known as an American Studies scholar, as an interdisciplinary scholar. And I did that for several reasons. For my own mental health, I wanted a smaller faculty, et cetera, et cetera. I feel like my work is extremely interdisciplinary, and I think it's so important. I think interdisciplinarity is so important to thinking, to thought itself. And I'd say that from the beginning, my work always crossed genres, right? Within literary study. Like I would look at maybe poetry or film or the novel tradition, or even music in my first book. But when I was coming through the ranks in college, interdisciplinary thought was like what we called an independent study major. And only the really like quirky kids did that, right? They were like, I'm designing my own major. We're like, good luck with that, right? Now we all know that if we went back to college, we'd probably be designing our own majors, right? Because there's so much. I do a little neuroscience, do a little philosophy, do a little literary study, work in American studies, and of course, history. So I think that as many, even colleges, I feel like so many colleges have in their promotional materials that, they want to move toward an interdisciplinary climate, right? But for them, that usually means getting rid of the humanities, right? Which are always already the first, not the humanities and sciences, but the humanities, which are always already the first interdisciplinary homes, right? On any college campus. So it's interesting that, that discursive line finds itself embedded in both places. But I think that the only way to come at a problem is using several resources, right? Mm-hmm. I also think that without thinking interdisciplinarily, we often, when I was, I tell people, Another is not a book that I could have written a decade ago.
Interesting.
People would have been like, what are you on about, right? When I was, I've been loving animals. I'm a big dog person. I had a cat at one time, Ebenezer. He's no Scrooge. He was the best friend to my shepherd at the time, Sula. I know it's embarrassing, but it's true. Her name was Sula May Peace because, that's how much I love Toni Morrison when I got my first dog, right? But I have been someone who has really thought of interdisciplinarity as central to all the work that I do, and that you cannot think about questions and in the same way without being broad-based, I guess. And so I don't think I'm doing a good job of answering this, completely, but because I lost that train of thought that I had. But for this project, I couldn't have written it 10 years ago, but it has its moment now. Mm-hmm. Right? It has its moment now because instead of people saying to me, why do you spend so much time on dogs when human beings are under such, especially Black human beings, right? And of course, one of the ethical arguments I make in the book is that, this is precisely what liberal humanism wants us to do, right? It wants to set us against these two things, against one another, right? Mm-hmm. That if you're thinking about non-human animal life, you can't be caring for Black life in particular. And I'm like, this is a profound lie that we get caught up in if we don't ask the outside questions, which the field has a method for, which is, not just slavery happened, not just its history, but the method that the field has to think about histories of enslavement have to do with, Toni Morrison asked those questions. Hortense Spillers asked those questions. What was happening when people were being whipped? What was happening between white women and Black women, right? Those outside questions that are only, I think it's the Folia Glimpse work, right? That are only possible in Black study, where we're like, well, wait a minute. Everyone's saying that we're making assumptions about these relationships. What does the archive say? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And for me, I'm like, we're making assumptions about animal life. We're making the chief assumption that Black people don't care about animals. Right? This is something that was going on throughout the entire discourse around Michael Vick, and it made me furious. And then, of course, I realized that MOVE was one of the first animal liberation groups in this country. Mm-hmm. But we give that, actually, I think PETA is more of an animal rights and liberation, but, everyone knows who PETA is. And so one of the things I say in the book is let's give MOVE their rightful place as animal liberationists, and let's study the why of that and the how of that. And that, of course, this inquiry came from Black study, their Black study, And so I guess what I'm saying is that an interdisciplinary work, if we see MOVE as only a Black radical group, we assume their politics. And that it took 20 years for someone to understand that their politics started in a very different place and always already stayed in that place. creates a different picture of move, a necessary picture, a more well-rounded picture. And so I feel like, to me, two things came together there: interdisciplinary concerns and a critique. What's my critique of Black study? That, Black horse lovers, I loved, the Black Lives Matter moment, which of course has morphed into so many other, organizations that carry the preciousness of Black life. But I loved, people texting me saying, "Sharon, there are 300 horses in downtown Houston right now." And they were like, "You were right. Where did all these Black riders come from?" I'm like, "They've been there all the time." We established the riding tradition in this country. Of course they're Black riders, right? And so I feel like the field, only in Black study can we critique Black study and then see what we need to see. And I think I'm so proud of being part of a group of people who can shift their vision. Because I don't see that happening in the population at large.
Yeah.
We can shift our vision as a field and go, "Whoa, wait a minute. We have not paid close attention."
Yeah. And so maybe that's the answer to this, but I'm curious what you think that the field has done well, but also what it has not done well. Because really what you just said there, that sense of shifting position is that interval between, what's been done well and what hasn't been done well. But I'm curious what you think, 55, I guess at this point, 55, 56 years after the founding, what's it done well? What hasn't it done well?
It's created a method of scaffolding that people borrow from all the time, even when they don't know they're borrowing from Black study.
Yeah.
Right? It's created a way. One, it's kept its pulse on the world as it is, as opposed to the way we would like the world to be, right? It's kept its pulse on our intramural relations in a very honest way. It is a field now. I can't imagine another field where inquiries, feminist inquiries, queer inquiries, have been soundly argued and discussed and adopted. Right? You can't really do Black study without thinking about the difference that sexuality makes. Now, some people attempt to do it, right? I'm saying that all those kinds of Black study do exist, absolutely, right? But for those of us really thinking about the interdisciplinarity of Black study, we make multi-pronged approaches. Black study is capacious. We have people like, Terry Pickens writing about disability study and its impactfulness, and really just mental health, in Black communities, and in our understandings of what constitutes the Black self. Elizabeth Alexander coming first with a book on Black interiority. I think that if anything, Black study, especially Black feminist study, has really taken that interiority, right, and turned it inside out. One, given it back to us, right? And I think that Black study does that very well. I think that Black studies is still, in many ways, gender specific. Its focus is very much, and I'm thinking of Erica Edwards here and other folks, thinking about that charismatic leadership, right? Looking for a particular kind of leadership. That desire in Black community and Black letters and Black study is very strong, right? And sometimes it leads us to overlook other things being said elsewhere. But that's also the culture at large, right? It's a culture at large. So I feel that Black study has really allowed for us to traverse the pain and the pleasure of Black living.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, no, this is fantastic stuff. I mean, it's that way that you fold both the challenge, like what Black studies needs to do, not needs to do better, but like the pressure on Black studies for different kinds of horizons and different kinds of framings is also folded into its own tradition. I really like the way you put that. And let me ask then, as a concluding question, which in some ways you've spoken to this question from the very beginning, but why not end here with it directly, which is, what do you think is the issue or the question we should all be thinking about, question we should all be asking?
It is so hard to, what can be said in this moment, right?
There's a wild moment to be asking.
Yeah,
This is the
I know.
third week of a far-right government.
Exactly. As we have been careening toward fascism for the last 20 years. If you really look at, I would say, the post-Jimmy Carter era, right? I think Jimmy Carter is a kind of flashpoint in a particular change in both in our two-party system and its attitude toward its constituencies. One could say, I'm no historian, but he was my first president. I think that in this moment, what we need to be doing, or what we should be doing, is doubling down on our joy, doubling down on the discipline of love, caring for our communities, and, preparing in two ways. Preparing to shelter folks and love on folks in these times, and continuing to do our work, which brings us joy. Mm-hmm. As to the object of Black study, I have always tried to stay away from, the momentary thing, right? Not interested in coining a new term or naming what I'm doing, because I'm not really interested in the entrepreneurial spirit of discourse, which universities love us to be interested in.
They really do.
Yeah. I'm interested in thought. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in radical thought. And, sometimes when you say radical, people, they're like, radical. How about middle of the road? I said, I'm not talking about politics. To me, radical thought is all thought that enables the living of all beings.
I love that. I mean, this is such a wonderful place to conclude. And, what you were saying there is also this reminder, and I don't know when the time for it is, except that the time is always. But, in this moment, in sheltering people, doing our work, love and joy being important, it's also it's a reminder that we have to have something to live with after. We have to have something to live for. And, I have to say, across this podcast, I was hearing so much of that, what this field offers us to not only mobilize in this moment for our thinking, but also a reminder of the things that really matter, and the things that we have to live after whatever number of years this is, right? And so all that's to say, I was really looking forward to this conversation. This has just been so fabulous, Sharon. I appreciate it so much. It's really, really interesting stuff. I'll be thinking about it, for days, and I can't wait for it to be live and for people to listen to it and think about all the issues you raise, all the questions you raise, but also, the real challenges that you put at our desks, our footstep, doorstep, however you want to put it, to really challenge us to think about our thinking differently and ask those critical questions. I value that so much. So thank you for that generosity and that critical challenge. This has been
Oh,
fabulous.
thank you, John. It's been wonderful for me. I don't often get to talk for 45 minutes about my deep love for Black study. So thank you for the opportunity to do so.
It has been a great 45 plus minutes of that. So yes, absolutely. Well, have a great rest of your day.
All right, you too.
All right, take care.
Ciao.